Hi, I'm Larry Nespoli with the New Jersey Council of County Colleges. At New Jersey's community colleges, we believe that our students, as well as all citizens, need to be informed about the important issues facing higher education. That's why we're proud to support programming produced by the Caucus Educational Corporation and their partners in public television.
Funding for this edition of New Jersey Capital Report has been provided by Wells Fargo, the New Jersey Education Association, New Jersey Council of County Colleges, PSE&G, committed to improving New Jersey's economy and strengthening its communities, JFK Medical Center, MagnaCare, and by Johnson & Johnson. Promotional support provided by NJ Advanced Media and by Politicker NJ.
Welcome to New Jersey Capital Report. I'm Steve Adubato.
And I'm Rafael P. Roman. Philip Murphy, a former Goldman Sachs executive and the former ambassador to Germany, recently established New Start New Jersey, a nonprofit whose goal is to find, debate, and implement ideas that can, quote, jumpstart New Jersey's economy from the middle class out. Ambassador Murphy, who's also considering running for governor in 2017, joins us now. Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rafael.
Now, we'll talk about the gubernatorial race in a moment, but let's start with your nonprofit. What does it mean to grow the economy from the middle class out?
New Start New Jersey is focused on exactly that, growing, strengthening our middle class. This is a state with a proud and very large component of our citizens who are in the middle class. There's been no real comprehensive agenda for their benefit for a long time now in the state. So we're all about trying to find very specific solutions that can add jobs, add to security and confidence in the middle class, and we're off to a good start.
Well, give us an example. Can you give us a concrete example of some of the things that means that isn't being done now?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of notions. A couple of months ago, we had a symposium with the Center for American Progress, and we came up with a list of ideas that we really like. Increasing minimum wage, including for tip workers. Increasing the earned income tax credit back up to where it should be at 25%. Child and dependent care to give people more confidence that they can go out and have their kids covered, go out and work, earn sick leave. This more recently, we just did a fairly extensive program with the Brookings Institution talking about advanced industry jobs in the 21st century, which has a particular relevance for urban centers. So those are some of the things we're looking at. Another one would be helping our long-term unemployed. New Jersey has one of the largest cohorts of long-term unemployed, defined as longer than 6 months out of work. What can we do to get that group back into the workforce? So that gives you some sense of some of the things we're looking at.
Ambassador, by the way, what would you like to be called? I always want to make sure.
People call me, I hope they call me Phil.
You okay with that?
I love that.
Okay. Phil, let me ask you this. Governor Christie has been governor for a good period of time. He's been able to establish his record and people know where he stands. Whether he runs for president or not is not the issue right now. The question becomes, in your case, rate Governor Christie in terms of his policies as it relates to the middle class. How's he doing?
Governor Christie, like many other governors over the past couple of decades, gets, I think, at best, an incomplete grade.
At best.
At best. And the reason is, and again, he's not alone in this drama, we have not had a comprehensive sort of 10 commandments. And I'm not sure myself at this moment that I'm fully formed on what all those elements should be. But we have to put our middle class first.
He hasn't?
I think he, again, along with a lot of other leaders in the state, have not. Like this is almost no question.
I mean, well, let me put this out there. You tell me if it's your definition of not putting the middle class first. So when we have Steve Sweeney, the president of the Senate, who says, you know something? We need to, in fact, increase taxes on those who earn $1 million or more. And the governor, who's been with us many times, says, no way, not doing it, not increasing taxes. Is the governor's policy and position on increasing taxes on on millionaires in this state supporting the middle class that you talk of, or is Senate President Sweeney's?
The governor is not right on that one. We have to have everything on the table, including a tax on our highest earners.
That's better for the middle class?
There's no question, because what's the alternative? To take it out of the middle class, to take it from them. I get worried about all the regressive nature of so many of the ideas and taxes that we talk about in this state. Let's make sure we've got everything on the table, including, importantly, a tax on our highest earners. We're in a crisis at the moment, but I'm an optimist. We can get out of this. There's no question about it. The crisis is that our revenues and expenses aren't balancing, and the people who are suffering are in our middle class. They're the ones on whom this enormous burden is falling. It's almost like an inverted pyramid. They've got the weight of all of our woes on their shoulders, and that's got to change.
You know, but Phil, Steve and I have been doing this show or shows like this one for over 20 years. And over the course of those years, there have been a lot of governors that have increased taxes on the wealthiest New Jerseyans, with a lot of promises that followed that increase, you know. And
about helping the middle class.
About helping the middle class, which never happened.
Yeah.
And this governor said, well, you know, let's try something different. Yeah. Let's try to make New Jersey open for business, friendly to people to come in and create jobs so that more people would have jobs and increase the economy. What's wrong with that?
Well, I'd say two things. One is, I think our citizenry, Raphael, as you rightfully point out, has sort of had it. They're fed up. They need honest adult leadership. People are going to tell them the truth, including if there's a tax for X purpose, that money actually gets spent on that purpose. And I completely accept your point. People have sort of had it. They want to know the truth, and they want adult leadership. Secondly, in terms of attracting business to the state, which we have to do, that's jobs, clearly, and keeping businesses here, I think we've made a mistake, this administration has made a mistake of narrowing the discourse, the decision as to how and why companies want to come here to simply a question of tax incentives. New Jersey has a lot of assets. Our location, our people, our schools, our infrastructure, even as crumbling as it might be. Let's take advantage of those assets, and I think that's the way you attract and keep businesses and jobs.
Phil, I just want to be clear. You believe the administration, the Christie administration, has relied too heavily on tax credits to incent businesses to A, come here, and B, stay here?
Yes, I do. I'm not suggesting that's not necessarily part of the solution, but if that's all you do, you get into a race to the bottom with your neighbors. You end up chasing your tail. I think it's important. Perhaps there are sensible tax strategies. I'm not suggesting there aren't, but it's got to be broader than that.
Okay, let me ask you this. It's interesting because it's middle class, supporting the middle class and helping the middle class. And the philosophy, I don't find anyone in conversation who would say, I don't support that. Right. It's in the details that becomes problematic. So someone would say, okay, support the middle class. Most middle class people often drive to work, frankly, too many, which is why we have so many problems on the roads. Yeah. And our roads and bridges, we know what's happening. They're crumbling, falling apart. The governor may argue there's not a crisis. People would clearly have a different point of view on that. Do you support the idea of increasing the gas tax in order to, frankly, bolster the Transportation Trust Fund, which most reasonable people believe is not only running out of money, but is facing a crisis as well? Increasing the gas tax to support the Transportation Trust Fund to strengthen our roads and bridges, which middle-class people are on every day.
You bet. And Steve, you put your finger right on it. First of all, nobody disagrees the middle class ought to come first. The question is where's the beef? Okay, where's the program?
Right.
How do you get there? Secondly, we've got, I think, by any measure, a near crisis in our infrastructure, and the TTF needs to be replenished.
Transportation Trust Fund.
Transportation Trust Fund. The gas tax is clearly one of the most talked about solutions to this, but you raise a very fair point. And by the way, we've got to do something. Let's stop the
debate. Doing nothing, not an option.
Doing nothing is not an option. But you raise the very fair point. That's a regressive tax. That takes it right out of the hide of the working families who get into the car after they drop their kids off and they drive to their work. So I hope, if that's the road we go down, that we can either find something to cushion that. So, for instance, I'd be all in and interested in, for instance, raising the earned income tax credit back up to where it ought to be at the same time you did something like that. Explain to folks what that means,
because they'll hear that and they'll go, what is that tax?
Listen, that gives people a chance to really get back on their feet when they're not making a gazillion dollars. That gets them back to...
to simplify is people get money back instead of giving money if they don't make a certain amount.
That's
exactly
what the
right.
earned income tax credit is.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's relied upon by a lot of our citizens, and that was cut back to 20% of the federal level, back up to 25%. Another idea, which I've heard other states have experimented, away from the gas tax, a mileage tax, which is something which is
How does that work?
That's geared on not based on fossil fuels, but how many miles you drive. Do you drive a fuel-efficient car? Do you drive off-peak? There are ways that you can sort of get into a better position as opposed to just a gross tax, such as a gas tax. But we've got to fix this, and we've got to make sure it's not taken out of the hides of our working families.
Another big issue affecting the state is the pension, the public pension employees.
Oh, is there a problem there, Ralph? No, I'm sorry.
Does your nonprofit organization, or do you, as a potential gubernatorial candidate, have an answer as to how to tackle the exploding cost of public employee pensions?
This is one, Raphael, that I know a fair amount about because I chaired the original commission which looked at the pension and health care benefits for public sector employees 10 years ago under Governor Cody. And we had a very extensive 6 or 8 month process. We included all the stakeholders, including the public sector employees, to come in and debate and discuss. We came up with a list of recommendations. I would say the headline would be, we all have to give a little bit of blood.
Give one thing. I'm sorry for interrupting, Phil. I'm just trying to manage time here. One thing, by the way, do public employees, in your opinion, right now, given what happened in 2011, the big deal that was announced publicly, should public employees give any more blood right now?
I'll tell you something. If we sat at a table and we signed an agreement and all three of us agreed to do our share, and one of us stood up after a couple of years and said, hey, by the way, I'm not doing my share anymore.
Did the governor renege on the deal?
How could you turn to people who had been doing their share and ask them to give more?
So the governor renege on the deal?
The state has to do its share, Steve. The state that was our recommendation, number one. The state has to step up.
So do you think that this year the state should pay an extra $1.6 billion at the possible cost of all kinds of services?
Listen, this is, remember I told you we did our report 10 years ago? The report still stands today, except you could fill in with different numbers. I just wish we had done what we had suggested 10 years ago, which was the state beginning its annual payments through this past decade. Now we're in a box. We're in a heck of a box.
Didn't pay
There's
before,
no magic
and it adds
bullet.
up to a huge number.
I think the whole, when we looked at this, was 12 and change billion, and it's now 40-something and change
and
billion.
Counting every day.
And counting every day.
You really want to take this job on? After everything we just described, Phil, you're leading a great life, you have a great family, you've made a few bucks, and you really want to take this on in 2017?
Listen, I've spent my whole life running into buildings that are on fire when people are running out. And I love this state. I believe, as we said a few minutes ago, this is a middle-class first solution. As tough as our challenges are, I'm a complete optimist. We need adult, truthful leadership, and that's why I'm looking so seriously at this.
If, in fact, you decide to do this, we're not going to ask you to announce it, even though that would be great, but make sure you come back and talk about your run for governor, and we'll get into more detail if, in fact, you announce for your candidacy for the governorship, okay?
I would welcome that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Phil,
Steve.
thank you.
Thanks, Raphael.
Ralph?
When we come back, an eyewitness report on some of the changes going on in Cuba. Stay with us.
To see more New Jersey Capitol Report programs, visit us online at njcapitalreport.org. If you would like to express an opinion, email us at info@njcapitalreport.org. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Steve Adubato, PhD. And follow us on Twitter at Steve Adubato and Raf P. Rahman.
We are honored once again to be joined by our good friend Josh S. Weston, honorary chairman of ADP, and full disclosure, he is also the chairman of Public Media NJ, the parent, if you will, of NJ TV, and also serves on the board of WNET. Good to see you, Josh.
Nice to be
Josh,
here,
welcome.
Steve.
Raf and I love having you come here. You talk about important public policy issues, and this is no less important, right, Raf?
Right.
Near and dear to your heart, this subject. You were in Cuba when, Josh?
About a month ago.
The revolution starts in 1959. So much has happened then. I'm looking here at the Record newspaper. Raul Castro, right in Panama. The president and Raul Castro get together. First time in 50 years, normalizing relations. U.S. and Cuba, you say?
It should have happened a long time ago, and it's rather silly in my opinion, although I'm not a politician, for our country to have put Cuba on a terrorist list alongside real terrorists.
Make the case.
This country has to deal with a lot of other countries that regrettably are dictatorships. We can't be the shepherd and the dictator to all these dictatorships that turn them into democracies. So I think we took it out on a lot of decent Cuban people by keeping them on the terrorist list. Doesn't mean you got to love them, but in my point of view, it was a mistake.
Joshua, how do you respond to arguments made, for example, by Senator Menendez, Senator Rubio, and others, that this was a great opportunity to open up relationships, but to get something back from the Cubans? The Cubans, as you know, the Cuban government depends largely on Venezuela, which basically subsidizes it to the tune of 20% of its GDP. But as we know, Venezuela is in dire economic strait and political chaos right now. Their argument is this was a moment to ask for some concessions about political prisoners, freedom of the press, and still open up with Cuba. How do you respond?
Well, it's okay to ask for things that you think are good for the Cuban people, but if you make that conditions of an agreement and say we are not going to open up to Cuba and take them off the terrorist list unless the leaders in Cuba agree to A, B, C, D, I think it's an unnecessary, imbalanced request. If we tackle every dictatorship or semi-dictatorship in the world and say we're not going to do business with you unless you become a pseudo-democracy, it's impractical. Where have we succeeded in exporting democracy to countries that didn't want it?
Josh, what did you see? And again, Raf, you and your family left Cuba in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
Your mom, your dad, and your brother.
Yep.
And you understand this in a way that most of us can only read about in the media. Josh, you were there. What did you see when you were in Cuba?
Well, when you asked me the question of what I saw when I was in Cuba, this was my second time in Cuba.
Go ahead.
Because I'd been there about a dozen years ago when it was a somewhat different Cuba. Now, between then and now, Cuba seemed to me a happier Cuba, an economically more developed Cuba, a Cuba that permits a lot of people to have their own businesses up to a limit, which didn't exist before. And last time I went there, I used to see soldiers on the street. I didn't see a single soldier in my 7 days in Cuba. People looked happier, more vibrant, a lot still needed. It's a mixed environment full of tourists from Europe and Canada all over the place. Relatively few Americans because you need a State Department license for that. So I think Cuba is on a good path. I wish our government and Raul Castro come up with agreements pretty soon. And usually when a big guy is dealing with a little guy, U.S. dealing with Cuba, and elsewhere in the world too, I think the big guy can afford to be a little bit more conceding than the little guy.
Josh, you talk about some of the changes that have happened. Can you give us some examples of some of the things?
Well, I'll give you one of the most dramatic ones. We were mostly in the Havana vicinity. One day we went east along the shore. It's the north shore of Cuba, full of very nice beaches. We were on a 12-mile stretch of highway paralleling the beach, and our guide, who was Cuban, told us along this 12-mile stretch, the only kind of buildings that can go up are hotels for tourists, and there already are 60 such hotels. I stayed in one of them called the Paradise Hotel. I had a 4-room suite. It was better than any hotel I ever stayed with in the U.S. So there's a vibrant tourist environment currently trading on Canadians and Europeans who are allowed to get there easily. Our folks can't get there easily, so they don't come yet.
So do you think that Cuba is ready for a mass of American tourists to descend on it yet? Or do you think it needs a little more time before it's ready for it?
I don't know what time will do, because whenever the gates are fully open, the volume of so-called descent on Cuba is going to be monumental. I hope it doesn't overwhelm the Cubans and create vast distortions in the economy where the jobs are. And also there's a risk if you get too many tourists in there, it might create more dirt. For example, when I was in Havana, I thought the streets were cleaner than New York City.
But Josh, excuse me, you told our producers that you saw, quote unquote, 2 Havanas.
Yes. I saw rundown buildings that looked as bad as I've seen in the Middle East where there were bombings. And pretty close to them saw very modern buildings. I saw condos that were 12 stories high, modern. I saw a hospital that looked as modern as anything I've seen here. So there's the contrast between rundown buildings, some didn't even have a roof on them, window frames without any windows. There just isn't enough money to maintain their infrastructure.
So you're confident that in the second trip, since the last time you went in 12 years, you saw, if I can call it the other Cuba, where people in fact are suffering and in poverty?
Well, it was much worse off when I was there before.
More poor people, you believe?
I didn't do a census on this thing.
What you saw, just from
When
what you
I
observed.
was there, they were still in the residual shadows of the former Soviet Union partner. Their buildings looked like they were built by the Soviet Union, means not too good quality. They started to decay rather quickly, and no money to fix them up, particularly when the Soviet Union disappeared. The Cubans couldn't export sugar to the Soviet Union and get money from the Soviet Union. So it was because there was no Soviet Union to buy their sugar. So they were going through very, very hard times. They're still a hard times. Let me illustrate it one way. I met a psychiatrist while I was there. All doctors in Cuba are on the government payroll. This psychiatrist is getting paid $60 a month as his pay. And saying the teachers there, all on the government payroll, getting paid $50 a month. I think every single professional called a teacher or a doctor, as well as others, has to have a second job. This psychiatrist was a doorman at our hotel. I've met teachers in my first trip to Cuba where they made more money handing out towel paper to tourists going into the ladies' room than they made as teachers.
Josh, the reason that's the case is because among the professions that are allowed to be independent or private does not include doctors or architects or engineers or teachers. You know, China, which is the lender of last resort to Cuba, is pushing them to open it up, saying, look, if you really want a vibrant economy, then you should allow, for example, doctors to practice the profession that you taught them privately. You should allow teachers to teach privately if they want. That would make the change. You as a businessman, what do you think?
Well, you had two different things combined there, doctors and teachers.
Is there a difference?
Yes.
Go ahead.
When you talk about doctors and you talk about private enterprise, you remind me of the state of health care in our country, where we spend 18% of GDP on health care with a private enterprise system, and our health outcomes are worse than other Western countries, where they spend half of what we do on GDP. So I don't think we, with our fee-for-service model, is something that ought to be transferred anyplace
But these
else.
doctors, as you say, these doctors are having to work in public bathrooms as attendees and cab drivers. Shouldn't they have the opportunity to do both, to work for the state and to work privately?
They've been underpaid. As I was told, those doctors didn't get a raise in the last 3 years. I don't know if that's true.
Yeah.
Secondly, there's two ways to open it up. If you just say, why don't you use the American system? That's what I was commenting on.
Right.
Because the opened up American system with fee-for-service wastes so much money without improved health outcomes that if someone told me, which would be a very bad thing to say in the United States, if someone told me you can only make a binary decision, would you rather have the government-controlled Cuban form of health care or our crazy system? That's an artificial question.
That's a different question, but what would you do? Oh, go to teachers then. What would you do to improve the situation for teachers in Cuba?
Hey, education
Because you've been a big advocate of teachers, charter schools, all kinds of reform, and big advocate supporting our teachers. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to put a word in front of teachers called good teachers. I think good teachers in our country, as well as Cuba, are underpaid. Now, we could have a whole meeting on teachers. So the shorthand answer is good teachers are underpaid in Cuba. And if I were somebody who had any clout in Cuba, I would think they ought to get more so they don't have to hand out towel paper in hotels in order to get by.
But the government is deciding that right now, aren't they?
Well, the teachers haven't had a raise in 3 years.
From the government.
From the government. All the teachers are on the government payroll. The government doesn't have enough money.
It's worse than that. Since 1989, after the Soviet Union collapsed, from what I read, the wages of everybody is 25% of what it was in 1989, on average. That's how bad
Well,
it is.
Cuba's biggest source of money back then was
It
the Soviet Union.
Sure, yeah.
That was probably more than half the government's revenue.
Yeah, pretty
Less than
close.
Go ahead.
What do you see what do you see from what you witnessed from the experience 10 years from now? What is Cuba going to be like 10 years
I think
from now?
Cuba's going to be more open no matter how long it takes. I think the U.S. and Cuba are going to open up movements back and forth of all kinds. And when they do that, I think their economy will have more buoyancy. They'll have tourists, I hope not too many. And that will also create jobs. And I hope the teachers and the doctors get paid more.
Josh, every time you come here, we learned something important and provocative, and you make us think, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That is it for this particular edition of New Jersey Capitol Report. From my esteemed colleague, Raphael P. Roman, I'm Steve Adubato. Thank you so much for watching. We will see you next week. Thank you, Josh.
New Jersey Capitol Report is a production of the Caucus Educational Corporation, celebrating over 25 years of broadcast excellence, and 13 for WNET. Funding for this edition of New Jersey Capitol Report has been provided by Wells Fargo, the New Jersey Education Association, New Jersey Council of County Colleges, PSE&G, JFK Medical Center, MagnaCare, and by Johnson & Johnson. New Jersey Capitol Report has been produced in partnership with St. Joseph's Healthcare System.
Seeing science in action makes students realize they can learn.
What is that organelle called? Elizabeth.
With the right tools, it's easy to motivate students.
Students need to know science to succeed in the global economy.
That's why NJA established the Center for Teaching and Learning.
To give teachers the training to make science come alive and to keep New Jersey schools among the best in the nation.
That's why we are so proud
to teach in New Jersey's public schools.